The Vikings were one of the most feared warrior groups in history. Many epic sagas and poems were written to underline the bravery of the Vikings on the seas, sailing on their dragon ships. There are also several stories about courageous heroes and warlords who, with only a strong arm, a sharp blade, and a sagacious intelligence, conquered new lands and accumulated great fortunes. But among these renowned warriors, one name was synonymous with respect and admiration: Ragnar Lodbrok. The legendary Ragnar Lodbrok was a king of Denmark and Sweden during the 8th and 9th centuries. One of the main sources of his story is called the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, which explains that the term Lodbrok means hairy trousers, as his trousers were made of boiled wolf skin with tar, which made them thick and resistant. The exact birthplace of Ragnar is still a mystery. Sources differ between Sweden and Denmark. Son of the Swedish king Sigurd Hring, Ragnar was part of the Yngling, an ancient noble lineage of Swedish and Norwegian kings. According to the beliefs of the time, they were descendants of the gods of the Nordic pantheon. The first Yngling was a legendary king named Yngvi, son of Njord, the mighty god Vanir of the sea. Yngvi founded the sacred temple of Uppsala, a religious center of Nordic paganism. After his death, he continued to be revered as an incarnation of the god Frey, something that increased the fame of his descendants. The historical context of the legend of Ragnar Lodbrok began during the reign of the great Charlemagne, king of the Lombards, king of the Franks, and the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. During the reign of Charlemagne, Christianity expanded rapidly in Europe, reaching the Nordic lands of Scandinavia, where it was initially not well received by the population. The proud Nordics held to their beliefs. They believed in the ancient gods, and armed conflicts, motivated by religious differences, became more and more frequent. At that time, the famous Viking invasions began, which until then were simple attacks by small groups of Nordic looters. Frank sources cite the name of a Nordic king named Horik, who reigned in Denmark between 827 and his death in 854. His reign was marked by the attacks on the Carolingian Empire of Louis I, the son and successor of Charlemagne. Ragnar was a jarl in King Horik's court, with the right to command a certain number of warriors and own land in his name. Ragnar Lodbrok's first great achievement was motivated by a desire for revenge. Ragnar gathered his best warriors and led an invasion against a rival kingdom. This kingdom was ruled by a monarch who had the reputation of being cruel and abusive. Many years before, he had been responsible for killing Ragnar's grandfather. It was on this occasion that Ragnar met the squire Lagertha. Like other women, she was a prisoner in the fortress of the evil king. Ragnar freed the captive women and gave them weapons so that they could participate in the struggle. He was impressed by Lagertha's bravery. She fought with the same strength and determination as the men. After a difficult fight, Ragnar and Lagertha won, and Ragnar was deeply in love with the brave squire. Lagertha refused Ragnar's approaches, and even put a bear and a huge dog to protect the door of her house to keep the stubborn man away. But even that didn't stop Ragnar. With a spear, he killed the two guardian animals, gaining Lagertha's respect. Ragnar returned to his land with Lagertha at his side, where they married and formed a family. In several versions, Lagertha was forced to marry Ragnar. Ragnar and Lagertha had a son named Frøydleif and two daughters. However, the couple's relationship was troubled. The constant discussions led to a separation. Ragnar sought a new marriage that would help him raise his social status. For his new wife, he chose a young Swedish princess named Thora, but the princess's father was overprotective and always placed a monstrous poisonous snake as protector of Thora's chambers. It was there that the imaginative Ragnar created his famous wolfskin trousers. His tarred stitching was able to resist the attacks of the snake. Ragnar defeated the snake and won the right to marry Thora. He had two children with her. In some ancient writings, their names are Eric and Agnar. At that time, Ragnar Lodbrok became the leader of several Viking invasions, spreading his name and amassing impressive victories. Several historical records state that in the year 845, a large fleet of Viking ships attacked and devastated many villages in the French kingdom, then attacking Paris. This event became known as the Siege of Paris. According to chronicles written by the Franks, it was led by a man named Ragnar, a name that many historians consider to be the legendary Ragnar. Paris was surrounded, and after suffering many attacks, the city ended up defeated and looted by the Viking horde. Paris endured many Viking onslaughts over the years. One of the most famous was the Siege of 885, in which the famous Rollo, Duke of Normandy, participated. Despite everything, he had no parental relationship with Ragnar. In the first siege of Paris, Ragnar was a celebrity, known and respected among the Nordic people, but cursed and feared by his enemies. But fate would be cruel with Ragnar. His wife Thora died noticeably young, which left him devastated. Several years later, during one of his adventures, Ragnar met a beautiful young woman called Aslog, who initially presented herself as a simple peasant. But Aslog was the daughter of two great Nordic heroes, Siegfried, the famous warrior who slew the dragon Fafnir, and Brunhild, one of the Valkyries, daughters of the god Odin. Ragnar did not consider Aslog's privileged lineage strong enough. To test the woman's intelligence, he challenged her, where she would appear neither dressed nor naked, neither hungry nor satiated, and neither alone nor accompanied. Aslog appeared dressed in a fishing net, biting an onion and accompanied by a dog. Impressed by that strike of genius and seeing in her a wise companion, Ragnar asked her to marry him. With Aslog, Ragnar had 5 children: Björn Ironside, Hvitserk Whiteshirt, Haldfan, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ivar the Boneless. Even after 3 marriages, Ragnar could not resist other women. There are reports that he had relationships with several lovers, many of whom belonged to wealthy and influential families. One of these women, whose name is unknown, gave birth to another son, named Ubba Ragnarsson. About Ragnar's appearance, there is a passage written: "He was the greatest and the most beautiful of men that human eyes have ever seen." Perhaps this explains his success among women. Little is known about Ragnar's life after the Siege of Paris. Some say he spent many years living like a true Viking, sailing off the coast of Ireland, Northumbria, and France, where he led new attacks on villages and cities. During Ragnar's absence, his children grew up to be respected warriors. Some even overcame their father's conquests. When Ragnar returned from his self-imposed exile, he was worried that his children were overcoming him. He began to fear a weak old age, where he would die forgotten in some lonely bed. To try to revive his name, Ragnar sought new supporters to lead a major attack against the kingdoms of England. The aim was to create permanent settlements and give new life to many Nordic settlers. But to his misfortune, few warriors volunteered for the journey. Ragnar left for England with only 2 warships. Ragnar wanted to land on the coast of the Kingdom of Mercia, but a major storm hit his boats, which sank in the turbulent waters. Ragnar survived the shipwreck and made it to the beach. Unfortunately, the storm led him to the Kingdom of Northumbria, where he was captured by soldiers of King Eil. Ragnar was a hated enemy, which had already caused many problems in Northumbria. Therefore, he was quickly sentenced to death. There is not much information on Ragnar's death. The most famous version says he was thrown into a well full of poisonous snakes. Ragnar may have died slowly, but he never begged for mercy, nor showed fear. He warned that his children would avenge his death. Coincidence or not, a few years after Ragnar's death, a great Viking army invaded the 4 kingdoms of England in what became known as the attack of the Great Heathen Army in 865. The leaders of that army claimed to be Ragnar's sons and would not rest until they avenged his father's death. Much of Ragnar Lodbrok's story is a combination of myth and reality. Many researchers say he is just a legendary figure. Others believe he was a real person whose history and achievements were exaggerated as his popularity grew. It is also possible that Ragnar was not just one person, but several personalities. As such, Ragnar is a literary character who aggregates the achievements of several Viking leaders. As for the renowned sons of Ragnar, many were proven historical figures, such as Björn Ironside, who sailed in the Mediterranean and sacked cities in southern Italy and Spain. Ubba Ragnarsson was a member of the Great Heathen Army which conquered the city of York in Northumbria and the Kingdom of East Anglia. Ivar the Boneless was one of the most feared Viking leaders of his time, known for not forgiving his enemies. For a time, he was king on the territory of Ireland. The stories about Ragnar Lodbrok may or may not be true, but his influence on Viking culture is undeniable. Nowadays, his legend continues to captivate us and awaken our admiration.
The Vikings left their mark on history as invaders and cruel plunderers, but they were also bold warriors, fearless explorers, and great navigators. During their incursions against other territories, the Viking warriors were led by warlords known as earls, whose number of responsibility was to choose the targets to be attacked, to ensure good in the army, and to split the plundered goods of the cities and villages. Generally speaking, most Viking captains were happy to attack merchant ships or coastal villages, getting back to their homeland with wealth and slaves. But some wanted more than ephemeral riches. They dreamed of conquering land for cultivation and animal husbandry, with the intent to establish permanent settlements. One of the most successful leaders of the Viking era was Rollo, later known as Rollo of Normandy. Rollo's birthplace is still a subject of discussion among researchers, varying between Denmark and Norway, around the year 860 AD. The details of Rollo's youth are still obscure, and many of his accomplishments have a semi-legendary portrait, like that of the famous Ragnar Lodbrok. Sources suggest that Rollo was a member of a noble lineage, having received proper training in fighting and commanding warriors in battle. Rollo soon became a promising and ambitious warlord, leading invasions in the region of the western frontier, where France is today. At the time, it was ruled by the Kingdom of the Franks. The first invasions in France were unsuccessful. The Vikings lost and were expelled, but they would not be kept away for long. A few years later, they returned with a large army which attacked the city of Rouen, leaving it in ruins. Ancient writings tell that Rollo engaged and commanded Viking invasions between 876 and 886 against Paris, a remarkable achievement since Paris was a formidable city with high walls and reinforced gates. Paris had been built on a portion of land surrounded by the river Seine. It would have taken more than 100 Viking ships to surround the city. Seeking to appease the situation with the Viking invaders while protecting his kingdom from certain destruction, King Charles III of France, also known as Charles the Simple, started to pay an increasing amount of silver to persuade the Nordic leaders not to attack his territory. Rollo was one of the leaders who accepted the tributes and even developed a close relationship with King Charles. Rollo received the valuable proposal to take over land in France, where he could bring in other Nordic settlers and start a new life on more fertile land. The condition for this agreement was that Rollo and his warriors would have to protect the kingdom of the West Francia against attacks by other Viking lords. This sort of proposal was common at the time, and many Viking captains accepted it without much resistance. However, as soon as they received the payment, they went back to their ships and set sail in search of new targets to attack or extort. But Rollo respected his commitment to King Charles and stood firm in defending his lands, taking part in important battles and defeating his former Viking fellows. As a reward for his loyalty, King Charles offered his daughter, Princess Gisela, to marry Rollo. But the marriage cost something, and Rollo had to agree to be baptized and convert to Christianity. With that, he would be tied to the royal family and the Frank kingdom. With the marriage now officialized, Rollo finally received, in 911, the right to the Promised Lands. And, as in the ancient French language, the Nordic were now called Normans. This territory became known as Normandy, the land of the northern men, whose capital was the reconstructed city of Rouen. Although Rollo is known as the Duke of Normandy, there are no contemporary records that he has received this title in his lifetime. The fact is that, after Rollo took command of Normandy, there were no further attempts at Viking invasions in the region, proving the great military ability of its new inhabitants. Rollo's influence kept growing in the royal court. New Nordic settlers arrived in Normandy, expanding its borders. Even after Rollo's death in 930, his descendants continued to rule over Normandy for many generations to come. His great-great-great-great-grandson, William I, conquered England in 1066, becoming the first Norman king of England. Rollo's life can be regarded as a success story. He managed to triumph where many failed, preferring to build a future for his people rather than seeking chaos and destruction. Björn Ironside was a legendary Swedish king who is said to have reigned during the 9th century. He is believed to be the first leader of the Munso dynasty, a Scandinavian royal house whose first members were considered legendary. According to the 12th and 13th century Scandinavian stories, Björn was the son of the notorious Viking king Ragnar Lodbrok. However, contrary to how he was portrayed in the History Channel's Vikings television series, his mother was not the famous squire Lagertha, but rather Princess Aslaug, Ragnar's third wife. Björn had 3 brothers. The eldest was Ivar the Boneless, with 2 younger brothers, Hvisert and Sigurd. There were also 3 half-brothers, Agnar, Eric, and Friedleif, Ragnar's sons with his first 2 wives. In the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok, Björn Ironside and his brothers continued the invasion started by their father and terrorized the areas of England, Normandy, France, and Lombardy. Historical records indicate Ivar as the leader of the band of brothers, while Björn was described as a capable and fierce warrior, able to change the course of battles. Björn was given the epithet Ironside, possibly in a reference to the strength of his arms or back muscles, which were compared to that of iron. Another explanation for this name was a mystical protection that guaranteed the physical integrity of Björn's hindquarters during battles. According to historical accounts, Björn, accompanied by the Viking lord Hastein, supposedly a friend of Ragnar Lodbrok, invaded southern France and headed for the Mediterranean. After entering the Spanish coastal regions, they proceeded to the city of Pisa, Italy. But they could make no further progress when they reached the gates of the city of Luni, which they thought was Rome. They eventually conquered Luni in one of Björn Ironside's most significant achievements. He managed to capture the city using his wits, a feature that made him one of the most famous Vikings in history. Having trouble getting past the Luni walls, Björn thought of a clever way to enter the city. He sent men to inform the city bishop of his own death, but that, before he died, he had converted to Christianity and wanted to be buried in consecrated ground. The city allowed his body to be brought in by a small group of guards, who secretly carried weapons under their robes. After entering the church, Björn suddenly emerged from the coffin, surprising everyone. Besides the warriors, he advanced to the city gates. He opened them, and his army entered to capture Luni. After sacking Luni, Björn and the Viking fleet invaded Sicily and the North African coasts. On their return home, they encountered the navy forces of Al-Andalus, strong Islamic rulers of the Iberian Peninsula. It was an unfortunate episode for Björn and his men, for they were hit by a weapon much feared at the time, the Greek fire, capable of igniting a wooden ship and burning even on the water's surface. Björn's fleet lost 40 warships, and the survivors were forced to retreat. The tale of Ragnar Lodbrok states that, after the enormous success of his sons Ivar the Boneless and Björn Ironside in the many raids in Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, Ragnar became jealous, not wanting them to rule Sweden in his place. Ragnar chose a man named Eystein Belli as the replacement king of Sweden, and, with only a small contingent of ships and warriors, decided to invade the kingdom of Northumbria and defeat his longtime enemy, King Ela. Ragnar was captured by King Ela of Northumbria and ended up dead in a pit full of snakes. Ragnar's sons decided to avenge their father by sailing to England. They formed the Great Heathen Army and brutally savaged the Saxon kingdoms. The Viking forces invaded Northumbria and captured King Ela alive. He was tortured by Ragnar's sons, and subjected to a cruel death in a ritual known as the Blood Eagle. Ragnar's inheritance was divided between the brothers, and Bjorn received the city of Uppsala in Sweden and all the lands therein. Alongside his younger brothers Sigurd and Hivisurk, Bjorn spent much time raiding and pillaging France before returning to his newly acquired kingdom. Bjorn had two sons, Refel and Erik Bjornsson. The latter would become the king of Sweden after Bjorn's death. Bjorn founded the House of Munso, known as the Old Dynasty, which ruled Sweden for many generations. However, they were eventually driven out of Sweden after an extended period of civil war in the late 10th century. In the 18th century, a tomb was discovered on the island of Munso, and many scholars claimed it to belong to the legendary Viking king Björn Ironside. Ivar the Boneless, also known as Ivar Ragnarsson, was one of the most famous warlords of the Viking Age. His reputation is evident in the Old Norse legends, where he is revered as a divine warrior. In contrast, British sources of the time considered him a demon from the depths of hell. The Norse sagas say that Ivar was the son of the famous Viking warrior Ragnar Lodbrok and his wife, Aslog. There are many theories about the origin of the epithet the Boneless. This term may indicate some of Ivar's physical handicap, evident from his birth. It is believed that Ivar had weak and brittle bones, or even no bones in his legs. Some historians believe that Ivar was impotent. The fact that he never married and had children may explain the nickname. According to the beliefs of the time, this deformity was the result of a curse. Ivar's mother, Aslog, known as a powerful seer, warned Ragnar that he was expected to wait 3 days before consummating his marriage. The gods would not be pleased if the couple rushed the wedding night. Ragnar ignored the warning, and Ivar was born with legs whose structures were similar to cartilage rather than bone. Because of his disability, Ivar had to be carried by his guardians on a stretcher or shield. Despite this inconvenient problem, Ivar had a great talent for planning and strategy, as well as being a skilled archer. Ivar had 3 younger brothers who became his main battle companions: Björn Ironside, Hiesturk, and Sigurd, all of them brave warriors. They often participated in raids together, where they were led by Ivar. The brothers rarely made strategic decisions without consulting him. Ivar was a born leader and loyal to his family. He was dismayed by the news that his father, King Ragnar Lodbrok, had been captured and executed by King Alla of Northumbria. Ivar demanded to know all the details of his father's death, who was thrown into a pit of poisonous vipers. The unfortunate circumstances of Ragnar's death fueled Ivar's hatred, and he began to plan his revenge against the Saxons. Ivar devised a cunning plan. He traveled to England, where he formally met with King Alla. To humiliate Ivar, Alla agreed to compensate him for his father's death by promising him a portion of land whose size could be covered with the largest cowhide available. So Ivar stretched a cowhide and cut it into thin strips, covering a much larger territory than intended. Due to his cunning, Ivar got a territory large enough to found the city of York, which would become one of the most important English cities of the Middle Ages. Ivar devoted himself to establishing local connections with other Viking leaders and Saxon lords dissatisfied with the King Alla. With new allies, Ivar asked his brothers to join him in his plan for revenge. The forces gathered by Ivar became known as the Great Heathen Army, which launched a wave of Viking invasions and conquest against the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms over 14 years. Ivar's army eventually defeated the Northumbrian forces and King Alla was captured alive. Ivar was ruthless when it came to punishing the man who had ordered his father's death. King Alla was sacrificed in a dreaded pagan ritual, the Blood Eagle. The victim's ribcage was opened from the back and his lungs removed. Ivar also threw salt into Alla's wounds, increasing his agony in the final moments of life. Little is known about Ivar's life after he consummated his revenge. Some historical sources say that a Viking leader named Eymar terrorized the northern Irish Sea during the 9th century. Eymar was the Old Irish adaptation of the name Ivar. This suggests that the legendary Viking leader attacked Ireland and had some relation to the nobility of that territory. And yes, after that time, The Dublin and York dynasties were closely linked. The most accepted theory is that Ivar remained king of York after avenging the death of his father. According to some Irish chronicles, Ivar died around the year 873, a victim of a sudden and horrible illness. In 1686, a farm worker discovered a Scandinavian tomb in Repton, England, near a site where the great pagan army defeated King Burgred of Mercia. The number of skeletons around the main tomb indicated that the man buried there had a very high status. It is said that this tomb is possibly Ivar the Boneless's last resting place.
From 793 to 1066 AD, the Viking Age was a period in the Middle Ages characterized by the numerous raids by Norse warriors known as Vikings, who undertook large-scale raids, piracy, colonization, conquest, and trade throughout Europe. Although they were mostly famous for their bravery as warriors, the Vikings were also accomplished sailors and explorers. There are many Norse sagas telling of the military conquests of powerful kings and warlords, who led raids against European kingdoms. The Norse sagas also tell of the adventures of several heroes and explorers who blazed the oceans in search of new lands to colonize. Perhaps the most successful Norse explorer of the Middle Ages was Leif Erikson. He was also called by Leif the Lucky, the son of the infamous Viking Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red, an explorer and the founder of the first Norse settlement in Greenland. Erik was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, along with his family and slaves. Upon finding a habitable area and settling there, he named it Greenland, which in a free translation means green earth, purportedly in the hope that the new pleasant name would attract new settlers. Leif Erikson is not known for certain whether he was born in Iceland or Greenland, since his birthplace was not chronicled in the sagas. There are few details about his youth, but it is reported that Leif served for a time in the court of Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway, from 995 to 1000 AD. By then, Christianity had already gained a lot of ground among the Nordic peoples, and many people in Scandinavia adopted the Christian faith. Leif was converted to Christianity while at the court of King Olaf. Once converted, Leif was charged with returning to Greenland together with a Christian priest to convert the settlers there. But he did not expect that he was about to experience the greatest adventure of his life, which would go down in history as the Vinland Sagas. During this saga, Leif met a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who claimed to have found unknown lands after he and his crew were knocked off course while sailing to Greenland. Believing it to be a dangerous place, they did not disembark, but rather sailed back east and eventually made it to Greenland, where they reported their discovery to the colonists. Leif eventually approached Bjarni, bought his ship, assembled a crew of 35 men, and mounted an expedition headed for the land that the sailor had described. Leif pursued the route indicated by Bjarni, and landed first at a rocky and desolate place that he called Helluland, the land of flat rock, possibly Baffin Island, Canada's largest. After he adventured further by sea, he landed a second time in a wooded place which he called Markland, the land of the forest. After 2 more days at sea, he landed on an island to the north and then headed back to the mainland. They sailed west and landed in a green area with a mild climate and plentiful salmon stocks. Leif decided to make camp there and sent groups to explore the country as winter approached. While on one of these explorations, they discovered that the land was full of vineyards and wild grapes. Leif therefore called the land Vinland, the land of vineyards. He and his team built a small settlement there, becoming the first Europeans to settle in North America. Leif's breakthrough is considered one of the greatest feats in history, as it occurred almost 500 years before the voyages of Christopher Columbus and John Cabot. The territory that was called Vinland depicts the island called Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the northeast of New Brunswick, regions located on the Labrador Peninsula in Canada. In the early 1960s, research by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife identified a Norse site located on the northern tip of Newfoundland, proving the veracity of the Norse texts about Leif Erikson's voyage. A location known as Lians Ox Meadows was suggested to be the original settlement of Vinland, but further archaeological evidence suggests that these buildings were actually a ship repair station and waypoint for travelers. There were no permanent Norse settlements in North America over the centuries, but knowledge of voyages to Vinland spread throughout medieval Europe. It has been suggested that knowledge of Vinland's location may have been held in European seaports in the 15th century. Christopher Columbus claimed in a letter to have visited Iceland in 1477, where he may have heard stories about this place. Leif, after spending the winter in Vinland, returned to Greenland in the spring with a cargo of grapes and wood. On the return trip, he rescued an Icelandic castaway and his crew, earning him the nickname Leif the Lucky. Leif, for unknown reasons, never returned to Vinland, but other explorers from Greenland and Iceland followed his instructions to venture into the newly discovered land. Leif Erikson's name is mentioned in a deed for the last time in 1019. He passed his title as the head of his family to his son, Thorkel, in 1025. Nothing is mentioned about his death in the sagas, but he probably died of old age in Greenland. On October 6, 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton issued Presidential Proclamation 7358, proclaiming Monday, October 9, 2000 as Leif Erikson Day. There have only been two kings in the English history who have been given the title the Great. One of them was King Alfred of Wessex, responsible for fighting off many Viking invasions and starting the unification of England. The second was a Dane named Cnut, who was king of England, Denmark, and Norway during his lifetime. Cnut was the son of Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark, until 1014. Not much is known about Cnut's childhood and youth. He was under 20 when he followed his father on the successful invasion of England in August of 1013. Cnut is described in the Norse sagas as a man exceptionally tall, strong, and good-looking, except for his nose, which was thin and quite hooked. He had a fair complexion and a fine thick hair. His eyes were nicer than those of other men, both more beautiful and sharper. This description is from the Cnut saga. As King Svein was conquering England, Cnut was put in charge of the Danish army. After his father's abrupt death, Cnut was crowned king by the Danish army. Nevertheless, the assembly of English noblemen refused to accept him and instead voted to reinstate the previous king, Ethelred, who had been defeated by Svein and was exiled to Normandy to the English throne. 2 years later, upon Ethelred's death, Cnut became the sole king of England in 1016. In the meantime, his brother King Harald II of Denmark eventually died in 1018, and Cnut was also crowned king of Denmark. When the young Cnut assumed the English and Danish throne, very few could have predicted that he would become one of the most successful kings of the early medieval period, ruling a Scandinavian empire that spanned the entire North Sea. To connect his lineage with the English dynasty and to protect himself against Normandy attacks, Cnut married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, daughter of Richard, the Duke of Normandy. As the King of England, Cnut blended institutions and ruled the English and Danish people as equals. By partitioning the country into the 4 great counties of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, he established the system of territorial lordships that would anchor English rule for centuries to come. Throughout his early reign, Cnut was a stern ruler and resorted to executions and exile to keep his precarious positions as king of the North Sea Empire. Cnut planned the murder of Edmund Ironside's brother, hunted Edmund's sons out of England to Hungary, and ordered the killing of many of his notable English rivals. After 7 years, when his government grew more stable, he adopted a less harsh policy and allowed more Saxons to hold positions of power. In 1028, Cnut conquered Norway with a 50-ship fleet from England, taking power as ruler of a massive empire around the North Sea. Cnut converted to Christianity and was an eager patron of the church. He sponsored leaders of the English church and was recognized by the Pope as the first Viking to become a Christian king. Setting sail on a pilgrimage to Rome, Cnut showed both reverence and humility. Upon his return to England, he promised his Saxon subjects that he would rule with mercy and justice. Cnut ruled England for 19 years. His protection against Viking invaders helped restore England's prosperity, and the resources he controlled helped him to establish a firm hold on Scandinavia as well. After attacks in Scotland, Malcolm II, King of Scots, recognized Cnut as a suzerain, and peace with Scotland was settled for the remainder of Cnut's reign. The great Anglo-Saxon king Cnut died on November 12, 1035, at Shaftesbury in Dorset, being buried at Winchester. Upon his death, Cnut was succeeded in Denmark by his son, Harthacnut, also known as Cnut III. One of his other sons, named Harald Harefoot, came to power in England, ruling until his death in 1040. This ends the story of the greatest Viking king to rule in England. Harald Hardrada was king of Norway from 1046 to 1066. However, even before he became king, Harald's life was packed with challenges and adventures that made him known throughout the medieval era. He remains relevant to this day and is one of the main characters in the Netflix TV series Vikings Valhalla. Born in 1015, Harald was the son of Sigurd Sur, the lord of some country lands in Ringerike, Norway. His baptismal name was Harald Sigurdsson, but he came to be called by the epithet Hardrada, meaning the strict ruler, referring to the toughness and firmness with which he governed and dealt with the noblemen, landlords, and clergy members. Harald was a half-brother of Olaf, who was later to become Saint Olaf. Harald and Olaf's parents are thought to be descended from Harald Fairhair, Norway's legendary first king, who unified all the rival fiefdoms through alliances and military force. Harald greatly admired his half-brother Olaf, who managed to control more of Norway in a few short years than anyone since Harald Fairhair. As the Norse sagas go, Olaf assembled an army to fight a rival lord who had stirred up a rebellion. The clash took place at the so-called Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Only 15 years old, Harald took part in this battle, which did not go well for the two half-brothers. Olaf was killed, but Harald managed to escape. Even though Harald was beaten, he did extremely well in battle, showing considerable talent for his young age. Aware that he would be chased by his enemies, Harald fled to Russia, where he was warmly welcomed by the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise and his wife Ingegard, who was a Swedish princess and Harald's distant cousin. Most likely, Harald took part in fighting against enemies of the Russian royalty, including the Poles, Byzantines, and some steppe tribes. After helping Yaroslav for a few years, Harald and his men departed to travel farther south. Around 1034, Harald and his men reached Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Norse called Constantinople by the name of Miklagard, a word that can be translated as Great Fortress. They joined the Varangian Guard, which consisted of elite warriors from Northern Europe and Britain, to protect the Byzantine Emperor. Harald was extremely popular with the Emperor Michael IV, soon becoming the leader of the Varangian Guard. Serving the Emperor, Harald fought from the Mediterranean to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it is reported that he made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His military prowess was chronicled by medieval Byzantine and Norse historians. Sadly for Harald, Michael IV passed away and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, who mistrusted the Norse warrior and ordered him arrested. Harald was in prison, but somehow managed to escape and took a ship back north. Back in Russia, Harald was still a young man, but he was now wealthy and experienced enough to be highly respected by the nobility. Harald married the daughter of Grand Prince Yaroslav, Elizabeth. Harald allegedly asked to marry her on his maiden visit to Russia when she would have been about 14 years old, but the request was declined because he was not wealthy enough at the time. Now having the marriage made official, Harald joined prominent European royalty members such as Henry I of France and Andrew I of Hungary. Not long after Harald arrived in Russia, Yaroslav raided Constantinople by sea. Arguably, Harald may have provided information about the city's military defenses. Nevertheless, the Russians were overwhelmed by the Great Walls of Constantinople and withdrew to their own lands. When Harald came back to Norway in 1045, he consented to share the Norwegian throne with his reigning king, his nephew, Magnus Olafsson I. When Magnus died in 1047 in a military raid against Denmark, Harald ascended to his rightful place as the sole king of Norway. He had spent the next 15 years trying to snatch the Danish throne from Sweyn II. After Sweyn's defeat at the Battle of Nis in 1062, both rulers acknowledged each other as sovereigns of their own countries. Harald expanded Norway's colonial dominions in the Orkney, Shetland, and Hebridean Islands. In 1066, he attempted to conquer England by allying with the rebellious Earl Tostig against the new English King Harold II. After securing initial victories, Harold's troops were defeated by the English king in September 1066 at the infamous Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold was slaughtered after an arrow pierced his throat. The remaining of his men fought on, but were ultimately defeated. This ends the story of the last Viking king, whose life was packed with sea voyages, far-flung land adventures, military glory, and political conspiracies, finding his demise on the battlefield as a true hero worthy of being called to Valhalla.